Hey everyone, welcome to another video. So if you've been watching this channel for a while, you might know that a couple years ago, I replaced my mid-range zoom and my telephoto zoom lens with this lens over here. This is the Tamron 28-200. And the main reason I did that is weight. For many years, landscape photographers relied on three lenses: the ultra-wide zoom, the mid-range zoom, and the telephoto zoom. And that's a lot of lenses and a lot of weight to carry. Nowadays, a few new lenses came out that kind of combine those last two, the mid-range and the telephoto zoom. This 28-200 being one of them. And it is maybe not quite as good sometimes as the best mid-range and long-range zoom lenses, but it is still a great lens. It saves a ton of weight in the pack, so if you're hiking or backpacking, it makes a giant difference. But recently I decided that I really want some extra reach. So I picked up this beast over here. This is the Tamron 50-400. Now this is obviously a much heavier lens and quite a bit more expensive. I'll show you the size difference here, and I'll put the weights on the screen somewhere. But for the 400mm reach, I think it is a good idea. So having recently picked this up, I've decided to do a direct comparison of these two lenses. We're going to shoot this mountain on a beautiful seashell inlet and see how they compare at different focal lengths, using autofocus and manual focus, and also using different focus methods, so hyperfocal distance and focusing on the subject. The idea, of course, with these two is not to carry both of them, it's to pick the one that makes the most sense for the situation. So if I'm going to a forest or a particularly long backpacking trip, I'll probably carry this one. And when I don't mind the extra weight and I want to shoot some really distant mountains, this will be it. Unless, of course, this one ends up performing terribly in comparison. But let's see. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom, and here are all the images loaded. Just to give you an idea of what's going on, the first 6 here are taken at 50mm with 28-200. And I took 4 at 125 and 4 at 200. This is at different apertures and so on. Then I repeated the process and repeated it 2 more times with the 50-400, just to give us a good sample to work with. Also, we had clouds coming and going, which made the comparison challenging, but it's hard to find a clear weather window this time of year here in British Columbia. However, I think we have enough material to work with. All of the images can be downloaded using the link in the description. They have a slight edit on them to bring up shadows and exposure where needed, as well as profile corrections, which is particularly noticeable on the 50-400. It has quite a bit of a vignette. So before we dive into the lens comparison, there's a few things we should talk about. First is autofocus performance. Both lenses have the latest firmware, and I was shooting on a tripod without image stabilization with my Sony A7r3 with a 5-second timer. Out of the 57 images, 8 showed any noticeable difference between auto and manual focus. It is most noticeable in this image here. I believe most, if not all, of the 8 were due to some kind of lens vibration, perhaps from wind, tripod movement, etc. In the remaining images, the difference between autofocus and manual focus was not noticeable whatsoever. So I think it's safe to say autofocus performance on both lenses is solid. Next, let's talk about hyperfocal distance compared to focusing on a distant subject, or nearly infinity. It's only relevant on the 50mm shot. So let's take a look. On the left is the image taken at f11, focused on the distant mountain, somewhere just over here. And on the right is hyperfocal distance, focused on the tree stump over here. The foreground on the image on the left is just not really usable. It is too blurry, especially here in the corner. And zoomed in at 200%, the background on the image on the right at hyperfocal naturally is more blurry. However, zooming in at 100%, the hyperfocal distance image is clearly the more usable of the two. It's nice and sharp in the foreground, and the difference in the background sharpness is not as noticeable. And we have to keep in mind that distant objects are generally actually supposed to be slightly less sharp than those close to us. So for a scene like this, hyperfocal distance is generally the way to go unless you are focus stacking, at least at f11. And we see the same thing with the 50 to 400 lens. Finally, before we dive into the lens comparison, let's look at open versus closed aperture on these two lenses. Looking at 50mm on the 28 to 200, the quality on the open aperture shot was slightly better. You can see over here, this just looks a little bit better. And you can see it in the houses here as well. But of course, the open aperture is just not workable for a shot like this. You'll pretty much always be using closed aperture. The same is true for the 50 to 400. At 125mm, there's a noticeable loss of sharpness when you go to f11 on the 28 to 200 around the center. You can really see it over here compared to here. However, towards the edge, the difference is less noticeable. On the Tamron 50 to 400, that difference is barely noticeable. This is towards the center, and then moving out towards the edge of the frame. There is almost no difference between these two for me. Finally, going to 200mm on the 28 to 200, open is once again a little bit better in the center. And perhaps slightly better towards the edge of the frame over here, for example, and further out. But actually it is quite hard to tell. And let's look at this edge here. Here, once again, open looks a little bit better. So overall, I would say open is a little bit better once again on the 28 to 200. Going to 400, the difference is almost not noticeable. The two look very, very similar. So overall, I would say when you have a flat focal plane, I can see it being useful to open up the aperture when you need a faster shutter speed. And sometimes you will gain an increase in sharpness, particularly on the 28 to 200. And by the way, for all of these, the closed aperture was f11. Now on to the lens comparison. On the left, we have the 28 to 200, and this is 50mm hyperfocal distance. The lenses are fairly similar towards the edge. There's almost no noticeable difference here for me. And the same over here. However, going to the center, we do notice that the 28 to 200 is quite a bit softer. The same was true when we were focusing on a distant mountain. We can see the houses here. It's quite a noticeable difference. But that difference becomes much less noticeable, perhaps non-existent, as you go towards the edge of the frame. At 125 open aperture, the two lenses are very, very similar around the center. There's almost no difference between these trees here. And towards the edge, the 50 to 400 is actually a little bit softer over here, but it is not a huge difference. However, going to f11, the 28 to 200 once again becomes a little bit soft in the center in comparison. And at the edge, they are fairly comparable. Finally, going to 200 at open aperture. They look fairly similar in the center. Maybe the 50-400 is a little bit better. Of course, you have to account for the clouds on the left side here that make it a little bit hard to compare. Let's bump the exposure just a little bit there to get a clearer picture. Yeah, perhaps the 50-400 is a little bit better. And then looking to the edge, the 50-400 is a little bit better over here at the edge as well. And I think the same is true on this side. Finally, going to f11. The 50-400 is once again better in the center by a little bit. And going to the edge of the frame, the 50-400 is winning here as well. So overall, the 50-400 is turning out to be a slightly superior lens. But we have not talked about its true power yet. Let's go into Photoshop. And here what I've done is I've upscaled the 28-200 shot at 200 to match the shot taken on the 50-400 at 400. And we can see a noticeable difference. So here's one, and here's the other. And you can clearly see which is which. Similarly, I've tried to downscale, so here the shot taken at 400 was scaled down to match the shot taken at 200. It's pretty easy to see still that this was the shot taken on the 50-400, and this was the one on the 28-200. The one case where it maybe doesn't matter that much is if you reduce the file size, maybe to the maximum height that you can upload to Instagram. And here, the one taken on 28-200 is still worse, but the difference is not nearly as noticeable. It's still noticeable, of course, but it's not quite as much. So there you have it. In summary, autofocus is great on both lenses, and I don't see any reason to rely on manual focus in most cases when using either of these. On both lenses, and probably any lens, on a scene like this, hyperfocal distance outperformed focusing on a distant subject. Though focus stacking would be ideal, the shot taken at hyperfocal distance was usable, while the one taken focused on a distant mountain was not. Another unsurprising finding was that open aperture performed slightly better than f11 in some cases, particularly on the 28-200. But of course, you have to consider whether you're getting everything in focus. It works well for distant mountain shots like this, where everything is far away. Of course, not counting these branches here. And finally, the 50-400 was equal or better than the 28-200 in all three focal lengths. It seems like a clear winner of the two, and I'm looking forward to using it more. I hope this comparison was helpful. Let me know any questions or thoughts in the comments. Consider subscribing if you are interested in joining me on future landscape photography adventures. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.